Revenge doesn't always come with a bang sometimes. It arrives in a whisper. A single choice, a single word, and everything built begins to fall apart. For Caitlin Clark, revenge wasn't about public takedowns or viral clapbacks. Hers was quieter, sharper. She simply said no. No to Geno Auriemma. No to UConn's storied legacy. No to the $1 million offer that came crawling back years later.
Like I said earlier, they actually had odds that, she was like third or fourth in the betting odds to be MVP of the WNBA. That's such a slap in the face to every WNBA player. It's unbelievable.
On paper, it sounded insane who turns down over $1 million for just 8 weeks of basketball, but this wasn't just a contract. It was a lifeline from a man who had once dismissed or belittled her and treated her like she didn't matter. When Clark said no, she wasn't just walking away from money, she was delivering a lesson. She humbled the man who thought he was untouchable.
That's the worst part about new fans. They have no perspective. There's no context. So they just say ridiculous nonsense.
On the surface, it sounded ridiculous who walks away from over $1 million for just 8 weeks of basketball? But this wasn't just a contract. It was a lifeline from a man who once dismissed her, belittled her, and treated her like an afterthought. When Caitlin Clark said no, she didn't just pass on a paycheck, she delivered something far more powerful. She humbled a man who had never known what it meant to be humbled. And that's what makes this story bigger than basketball. It's not just about points, assists, or trophies. It's about power. For decades, Geno Auriemma was the gatekeeper of women's basketball, the coach who decided who mattered, who got the spotlight, and who faded into the background. But Caitlin Clark flipped that script. She didn't need his approval, his program, or his checkbook. She built her empire without him. And when he finally came calling, she turned him away with quiet authority, the kind that says, "I don't need you. You need me." Every revenge story starts with a mistake. Geno's wasn't a misplay or a bad timeout. It was arrogance. Pure, blinding arrogance. Before Clark became the face of the sport, before the sold-out arenas, before the record-breaking ratings, she was just a kid with a dream. And like many kids who love the game, that dream led straight to UConn. The dynasty, the empire, the home of Taurasi, Moore, Stewart. For a girl growing up in Iowa, there was nothing bigger. So when recruiting season arrived, the next chapter seemed obvious. The most electrifying player of her generation, paired with the most legendary recruiter women's basketball had ever seen. But the call never came. Geno never picked up the phone. Never called Clark, never reached out to her parents. Barely even sent a message through her AAU coach. For the so-called greatest recruiter of all time, the silence was deafening. And it wasn't an oversight, it was a choice. The message was clear. She wasn't their priority. His excuse: UConn already had Paige Buchers and didn't want 2-point guards. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. But then came the insult. Geno suggested that if Clark really wanted UConn, she should have called him. Think about that, the coach who built his legacy on spotting once-in-a-generation talent before anyone else decided Caitlin Clark wasn't worth the effort. Then blamed a teenager for not chasing him. That wasn't just a recruiting miss. It was disrespect, the kind you don't forget. Clark didn't rage or retaliate. She simply filed it away. If UConn didn't believe in her, she'd go somewhere that did. So she chose Iowa, a program without UConn's banners, mystique, or dynasty glow. To some, it looked like a consolation prize. But for Clark, it was freedom.at Iowa. She wasn't in Paige's shadow. She wasn't Geno's afterthought. She was the recruit, the one expected to carry a program. And from the second she laced up in Iowa City, she rewrote the narrative. Her logo threes weren't just buckets, they were statements. Her sold-out arenas weren't just hype, they were proof. Her record-shattering TV ratings weren't accidents, they were receipts. Every basket, every viral highlight, every broken record was a reminder. You missed this. Meanwhile, Geno doubled down. Instead of humility, he leaned into arrogance. He brushed her off with condescending soundbites, calling her a kid playing like she's in the driveway. Instead of acknowledging her as a generational force, he tried to reduce her to something ordinary. But ordinary doesn't sell out Madison Square Garden. Ordinary doesn't drag the WNBA into mainstream relevance. Ordinary doesn't cost you millions. And that's where the irony cuts deepest. Geno closed the door when Caitlin Clark knocked. He thought she'd fade into just another pretty good player. Instead, she built the biggest empire women's basketball has ever seen, without him. And when he finally circled back, contract in hand, Clark didn't rage. She didn't gloat. She simply said no. And that one word cost him more than any championship loss ever could. But Geno couldn't help himself. Anytime Caitlin Clark's name came up, he found a way to tether her to Paige Buecher's. If Clark was fearless, so was Paige. If Clark was a fan favorite, so was Paige. It wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. By linking her to his chosen players, Geno tried to keep himself in the spotlight, to convince the world that Clark's rise wasn't unique, it was just another branch from the UConn tree. But the act wore thin. Fans noticed. Analysts noticed. Coaches noticed. People saw through the shade. Clark's brilliance didn't need comparisons. She was selling out arenas bigger than most pro franchises, breaking records the sport had never seen, and rewriting the entire narrative around women's basketball. And still, there was Geno, smiling for the cameras, subtly clinging to his throne. But behind the charm was something else. Insecurity. The kind that creeps in when the spotlight shifts, and you realize there's nothing you can do to stop it. Eventually, the mask slipped. The backhanded compliments weren't enough anymore. Geno went from undermining Clark to outright attacking the people who supported her. For months, his strategy had been passive-aggressive jabs dressed up as commentary. But in June 2024, during an interview on The Dan Patrick Show, he crossed a line he could never walk back. The Hall of Fame coach, the man who once was the pinnacle of women's basketball, didn't just question Caitlin Clark. He went after her
delusional fan base that follows her, disrespected the WNBA players by saying she's going to go in that league and tear it apart. There were actually odds on she's third or fourth in betting odds on being MVP at the WNBA. These people are so disrespectful and so unknowledgeable and so stupid that it gives women's basketball a bad name. Okay, so the kid was set up for failure right from the beginning.
His words weren't subtle, they were a direct hit. He called her supporters delusional, said they didn't understand the game. And then, unbelievably, he accused them of something even worse, damaging women's basketball itself. Their crime believing that Caitlin Clark as a rookie could finish near the top of MVP voting. To Geno, that wasn't passion, it was stupidity.
And Diana said it best, this kid's in for a rude awakening.
V5. Millions of new eyes had just flooded into women's basketball because of Caitlin Clark. Families were showing up in her jersey. Kids were camping out just to catch a glimpse. Casual fans, many watching the WNBA for the first time ever, were suddenly invested. And Geno's response? Not gratitude, not celebration, but insult. Instead of welcoming the tidal wave of new energy, he mocked it. This wasn't analysis. It wasn't a coach breaking down strengths and weaknesses. This was personal. A direct shot at the heart of Clark's movement, the very people who had carried women's basketball into the mainstream. Geno wasn't just dismissing Clark. He was dismissing the fans who made her rise possible. And because he's Geno Auriemma, people listened. His words carried weight. That's what made them so damaging and so revealing. By calling her supporters clueless, he wasn't just underestimating them. He was underestimating her. He was saying the hype wasn't real. That the success wasn't sustainable. That eventually he'd be proven right. But here's where the story turns delicious. He wasn't right. He wasn't even close. Clark didn't clap back on Twitter. She didn't vent in interviews. She didn't need to. Her response came the only place that mattered, the court. And what followed wasn't just vindication. It was the demolition of Geno's credibility. Caitlin Clark won Rookie of the Year. Then she made first-team All-WNBA. And when the MVP votes came in, she finished exactly fourth, right where her supposedly delusional fans said she would. The same prediction Geno mocked had become reality. And with it, his authority crumbled. This wasn't just a win for Clark. It was vindication for her fans, every parent who brought their kid to see her, every casual viewer who tuned in, every new supporter who believed the hype. Geno dismissed them as part of the problem. Clark proved they were prophetic. And the beauty of it all? She did it without saying a word. No rant. No confrontation. No drama. Just results. Night after night, she delivered logo threes, ankle-breaking crossovers, highlight reel assists. By the time the awards rolled in, There was no debate. She had silenced him without ever speaking his name. Oh, you see the poetry in that. Geno had styled himself as the gatekeeper of women's basketball knowledge, the wise elder who knew better than the fans, better than the media, better than anyone. But in the end, the fans were right. Clark was right. And Geno was wrong. Every sold-out arena, every shattered record, every historic accolade was a reminder. He wasn't the kingmaker anymore. She didn't need him. She never did. And here's the true irony: Clark wasn't even trying to prove him wrong. She wasn't chasing his approval. She probably wasn't thinking about him at all. She was just being Caitlin Clark. And that alone was enough to humble him, enough to expose him, enough to show the world that Geno Auriemma was no longer the one shaping the narrative. She was .by the end of her rookie season. It wasn't just about whether Clark had lived up to the hype. It was about how completely she had obliterated every doubt. Geno's insults didn't age well. They aged like milk in the sun. His takes on her fans now read like some of the worst commentary in sports history, bitter, insecure, and embarrassingly wrong. But Geno couldn't let go. Being wrong wasn't something he knew how to handle. And by then, it wasn't just about Clark's game. It was about what she represented. The changing of the guard. The shift in power. The undeniable truth that women's basketball no longer revolved around him. And instead of accepting it, he did what he always does: he kept talking. Interview after interview, podcast after podcast, her name never far from his lips. And every time, the pattern repeated: a little praise, a little dig. A compliment wrapped in a disclaimer. But the more he talked, the more obvious it became Caitlin Clark wasn't just rewriting the record books. For months, he had tried to shape the narrative with shade and spin, ignoring her rise, brushing off her dominance, tethering her brilliance to his own legacy. But Clark kept winning, kept shining, and his influence kept shrinking. If he couldn't control the story with his words, maybe he could do it with money. Enter the $1 million offer. Why then? Geno had already tried everything. He had ignored her as a teenager, downplayed her success, belittled her fan base. He tried to reframe her stardom as just a side effect of UConn's dynasty. But none of it worked. Clark kept climbing, and Geno kept fading. Then came an opportunity wrapped in dollar signs, a brand new high-stakes 3-on-3 women's league backed by Breanna Stewart and Afisa Collier. Ambitious, well-funded, and Geno was heavily involved behind the scenes. The league had talent, had back